Hello, everybody. Welcome to MHTV. We've got a fantastic session for you tonight. Really pleased to have you with us. We're going to be looking at how risk management practices can impact recovery. But before we get started and meet our fantastic guest, let's go over to Dave so he can tell you how you can join in. You can ask any questions that you want. Dave?
Yeah. Thanks, Nicky. Hi, everyone. As always, there's a couple of ways to join in tonight. The first is on Facebook Live. Just head over to the right of the screen. And if you want to add any comments or questions, feel free to do that. The other option you've got is over on X, and you just need to post with the hashtag MHTV, and I'll be looking for those as well, and try and bring in any comments or questions in tonight's conversation. But without further ado, straight back to you, Nicky.
Okay, so let's come to our guest. So, Kris, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
Oh, right. Hi, I'm Kris. I've worked in sort of acute mental health care for about 12 years, and then went to the dark side of academia, and since then I've been teaching and also doing studies into how I think how we can improve risk management practices in acute mental health care, really. Yeah.
So okay, so that we know what we're talking about, when we're talking about risk management practices, what does that involve? What are we talking about with that?
Well, that's a contentious question, I would say. So risk has many interpretations. Just to say, as a caveat, it's moving more towards safety now, which is also a little bit contentious. But risk, I suppose, in a traditional sense, is things that are clinically defined to be harmful to the patient or others, which the patient may relate to in some sense, be it family and so forth. So risk is certainly something came out in the 70s, Nicky, really. The sort of measurement of it, in part, some people argue, because inpatient units were being kind of fooled up. There was a sort of misunderstanding, which still sort of seems to be occurring now, that people that go into such places are dangerous.
Yeah.
And dangerous is very subjective, and so they try to make it a bit more empirical and measure what risk is. So risk in psychiatry is very different to how risk might be measured elsewhere. So risk, by definition, is something that is measurable because it has properties. So if you go into banking, for example, you can make sort of calculations on doing things. But in psychiatry, the challenge is that risk isn't really that measurable.
Yeah.
You can't really predict it. Though, so there's lots of sociologists arguing, well, it's been used to sort of give it a veneer of scientism, if you like, when it really isn't all that scientific.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is a lot of different things happening at once, isn't it? And they're all kind of converging. So in society, we have a lot more expectation of measurement and control perhaps than we did before.
Sure.
And then what our idea of what professionalism looks like has changed as well. And our idea that, with the right information, any situation can become less risky. We've had that since the 70s, everything from understanding more about smoking, seat belts being worn. So we've had this huge kind of influx of safety work, which is to be welcomed. But I think those kind of single variables are very different, as you're saying, to the kind of real complexity that occurs on an acute ward. So for anyone who hasn't had that much experience of acute wards, you're talking about spaces between 12 and 20, 25 people, all of whom are extremely unwell these days. Much more poorly than perhaps they would have been in the past, with a real mix of issues. Some people who should be discharged and there's nowhere for them to go. Sometimes people are being assessed. Sometimes people are being actively treated. And on top of that, we've got 3 different staff changes over the course of 24 hours. And people coming in and out, professionals, friends, relations, colleagues. And it's quite it's a hard place to find peace, shall we say. And I think those things make it quite a complex idea to make risk managed under those circumstances.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, there has been sort of models of care to sort of look at how risks are managed in these sort of settings. You have safe wards is been a sort of prevalent sort of model over the last decade. And I suppose, but there is surprisingly less recognition about how service users, for example, can feel really unsafe in these environments that are meant to promote safety. So the question becomes really, I would suggest, who defines the term? And, you know, when a person comes in, they're obviously in great need, but there's also sort of paternalistic approach where the need is sort of taken away about how things are defined that are personal to that person to fit the management of these kind of settings, you see. And so one could argue, you know, is it safe when the ward is running well? Or, you know, despite the fact that people on the ward may not be feeling that safe.
Yeah. And I think,
and then what is risk then, you know?
And I guess one thing for maybe if you're a student or any member of staff to think about is the experience you have when you're first on a ward in a different environment. That's some measure of how a service user might feel.
Sure.
Because the times when I've felt most anxious at work are times when I've done things like forgotten my keys, and all of a sudden I can't get in and out, or my fob, and I can't get in and out of any door, and I don't have an alarm necessarily to call for help if I need to. And what we forget is that's how service users are the whole time.
Yeah.
That's what their experience is the whole time.
Yeah.
They're in an environment where they don't know what other people have in terms of potentially risks or potential behaviours, whereas every member of staff probably will have had a handover. They'll have a means of calling help. They'll have a means of getting in and out. They're not there the whole time until someone decides to let them out. And that's a very different experience. So, and I think in mental health, we get very used to things very quickly. Like, I remember the first time I went on a mental health ward, I was absolutely terrified. And I was thinking, this feels very unsafe. Everyone here feels very poorly. And then I realised I was in the reception, hadn't even got into the ward yet. And then given me 3 weeks working on that ward in all its kind of joyful chaos. And I didn't see any of that anymore. No. And I didn't have that experience. So there's something about risk, which is not just about what's externally measurable, but how it's internally perceived.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that when you go onto a ward, you stop every now and again and think what it's like for people who don't have your familiarity with what's going on and why it's happening and your power. And I think sometimes maybe student nurses don't feel very powerful, but even like the lowliest student nurse can get in and out.
Yeah, I think you make some really important points, and it's certainly something that we found in this study, which I'm sure we'll elaborate on later. But it's notion of taking your work for granted. It's a human thing. Wherever we work, whatever we do, there are days where we just want to get it done. And with that, and certainly when you're working in an environment that can be quite traumatic, there can be lots of things happening, a lot of challenges, a lot of spinning plates. It can be a focus of minimizing those kind of things and ensuring that you walk away from the day, you know, being the best you can be. Except the fact that actually causes, I would argue, a divide between the experiences of the professionals that are working on the ward compared to those who are actually having to live there. I would say live there because that is the case for a number of people where they, you know, it isn't a job, it's their life. And that can be a real separation. So, for example, with the study, which you know, showed that actually we need to be really connected to the outside world, how the service user connects to their own life, what's meaningful, and bringing that into the ward. I mean, this is not rocket science. It's been said many times before in various documents and literature, but we can't do that necessarily very well unless the staff working in these environments are acutely aware of how bizarre their work is. Is my view. You know, the first thing to remember is this work isn't normal compared to society. In fact, the work that nurses do, and I call myself in it, you know, because I've done this work, is the one who's the abnormal, if you like, compared to those who are having to go into these settings to receive the care. Now, that's not to be derogatory to the staff that work there. It's more to say, to accept, go, hey, hold on a minute. All the stuff I do, would I do that in my everyday life? Let's take observations, for example. And for those who are not aware, observations in an acute inpatient setting, for example, would be a way to sort of keep an eye on people to ensure that, as far as you're concerned, for your clinical perspective, they are safe, they're not at harm, you know, be it engaging in self-harm or activities like that. Now, let's go shopping. We're going shopping. You know, we do our daily shopping, maybe once a week, and some dude is following you around the shop saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just making sure you're okay. Or they don't even speak to you. They have a clipboard, they note something, and then they disappear perhaps for 15 minutes, and then you see them pop up again. In what world is that actually deemed normal? So, you know, when we think about the very practices that we do, we actually create an environment where risk or the observation of it is the prevalent approach to care or treatment, overriding anything that might be relatable perhaps to the world outside. And you start to question, well, why is it that people do take their own lives so to great levels when they leave a hospital, when the whole purpose of the hospital was to reduce that risk? And let's do a comparative, which someone told me, that I have a heart problem. And let's say I am 70% likely to have a heart attack. I go into hospital, that reduces to 20% due to the treatment, but then it increases to 80% when I leave the hospital. Well, you've got to start asking, well, in what way does the work relate to the outside world, you see? And suicide in this case is a risk that's really focused upon, but stopping someone taking their own life within a controlled environment doesn't inspire the desire to live. And so we need to work on those kind of things within these settings, for sure.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost measuring success and failure on different timescales. It's like, oh, I helped somebody not die while they were an inpatient, but then the rest of their life is there. And you're like, okay. But I think going back to what you say about kind of invisible work, I can remember talking to, I was ward managing, talking to someone, I was saying, you know, how's somebody doing? Say, well, they say that they hate being followed around. And so I think they're a bit paranoid. I'm like, you are following them around though, aren't you? Like, they're just telling you that they don't like you following you around. They're not paranoid. They're describing what's happening. And you've forgotten that you're doing that.
But that's part, sorry to interject, but that's part of taking your work for granted, without having actually tried to take yourself from that daily task, which is very routine in most inpatient settings, I would wager, that if you do it, you just assume that the person that you're observing will just get it's a part of keeping them safe or something on those lines. But actually, a lot of people do not explain this practice to the service user. And now, service users are acutely aware that they're being surveyed in some fashion. You know, if you look at some nursing stations or offices, they tend to be central, so they can observe the ward from different directions. And so this notion of surveillance, which has been written about, you know, by Foucault and so forth for many years.
Don't worry, we've got an episode on the panopticon, which people can go back
to. Well, there you go. Brilliant. Bethlen's original idea of the prison, and then obviously looked at in surveillance terms by Foucault. But for example, they know they're being observed. They feel the observation. Why not make it clear about the reasons for doing so? You know, what does that tell you? For me, it tells you that you actually are considering how your practice is perceived to the other person. Now, if you don't do that, you result in some of the results that we found. People start to really question their reality. Of course, we could say, well, of course they're going to do that because they're unwell, perhaps. But actually, we can make people feel worse by not explaining what we're doing. And so when we interviewed service users for this particular study, we indeed, they were saying, well, nothing's explained. We don't understand why they're doing certain things. And it kind of added confusion to my reality of the hospital. And if that's the case, that's going to increase it's going to raise anxiety of the person. And if that happens, that's not going to help their mental health. And so you're kind of asking yourself, are the very actions that we take for granted, and bear in mind, I have done these things, so I'm not,
me too.
You know, I'm taking ownership of it, actually worsening the mental health of patients. Now, That's not a surprise. We know that ideally people should be helped at home, etc., in the community, or however we define that, or the service user defines it. But actually, we can do things a little bit better in inpatient units by being simply transparent about the reasons for why we do things.
It's really different, isn't it? I mean, our old office used to be called the Goldfish Bowl because you just spent staring in and out of it.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference,
exactly.
isn't it? But by having someone just looking and just giving you a wave and saying hi and checking in on you, while mysteriously coming in and out, writing stuff down and leaving. I mean, the two things feel very different. One feels sort of nurturing and even if it's irritating, it's being looked after. You can be appreciated as that. And the other one is frankly a little bit sinister, particularly if you don't know who you are or where you are. And the other thing I think with wards is because they've got so many alarms, fire alarms, lights, things that are beeping, they're kind of very set up of like, you know, when the new system is put in, they don't take the old one out. Ceilings are filled with like weird flashing boxes. And if you're already feeling anxious and a little bit paranoid, this stuff just spirals you up because no one ever says, oh, it's the old alarm. No one ever took it down.
Right.
There is no explanation as to what's happening and why, because we don't see it. So we've talked a little about the context this sits within. We've talked a little about some of these problems, you know, sort of that idea of staff not even realizing what the impact of their behavior or actually how their job looks from the outside. So what other issues did you see that were kind of coming up through communication?
So in this study, I guess it might be helpful if you think it is, to talk about the methodology of how we came up with the result. So we used the grounded theory approach, constructivist grounded theory, which simply means that, you know, instead of interviewing people, so it's qualitative. So instead of interviewing people and then collectively taking all the interviews and making sense of that data, you interview one person and then you make sense of it, and it builds upon creating a theory. So a theory, very simply, and any grounded theorists out there will be probably shouting at me going, oh, you haven't said the whole thing, but I could talk about it for hours. It's simply, it's there to look at things that are underexplored or not understood very well about the impact of certain social interactions or social situations. So in this case, I certainly and the research team kind of defined risk management as in a social context. Nurses, for example, are doing things to patients or things are happening between patients and staff. That makes it a social context. Through interviewing people, we found there were two sets of results, actually. So to contextualize a little bit before I present those, you know, there is a wealth of data out there about the challenges of risk management. It's been written about for many years, from Castell in 91 to Nicolaius Rose in the late 90s and various authors, of course, leading to models like safe wards, though I'm not too certain if safe wards kind of identified risk management per se as being part of restrictive practices. The service users that I interviewed did. So they basically they weren't sure what risk management was, which is really interesting, even though it's from a clinical staff perspective and certainly the patients, they saw it embedded in everything. You know, everything we do is related to managing that risk in inpatient care, I would argue. So they had to sort of make sense of it. What is it? What is risk? Well, actually, they saw it in the context of promoting their conformity to the hospital apparatus. So, which is not an unusual finding, but at the same time, it's how the people there were interpreting this kind of experience. And so that led to the first theory. It was about, it sounds very complicated, but it's called ontological insecurity, which simply means, in layman's terms, or layperson's terms, forgive me, is this idea that your reality, you're confused about your reality, you're anxious about it, you can't make sense of it. What's going on? Why did that person? It feels like gaslighting, Nicky. It feels like you're constantly gassed at it about your reality. You know, everything you know about the world, certainly for people who have first admissions in such settings, cannot relate to the reality of the hospital, and it's compounded by people taking it for granted, who are facilitating that care, almost giving the impression to people that you should just understand this because we're in hospital. And it's interesting, and I've said terms like this. So they couldn't really understand how it was helpful. And so you would see an increase in violence, but not because they were unwell. It's a way of trying to make sense of and rebel.
Frustration.
Frustration is a great word, but also rebel against the system a little. Or you'll see over-compliance, people that are just going to be doing exactly what they're told to buy their time and get out. And so it's interesting how when people are compliant, that there's a correlation to wellness. So, they're really understanding. They must have insight. Therefore, insight means that they're getting better. Therefore, they are able to leave eventually. Well, actually, if you take in consideration studies of animals in sort of zoos, there's this sudden surprise when Timmy the tiger bites your hand off, even though you've been looking after Timmy for 10 years as a zookeeper. Well, Timmy doesn't want to be there ultimately, and Timmy wants to be in their own environment. And I know it sounds horrible to compare animals to humans, but the psychology is very similar, And if we understand that, we can really work better with people in these environments.
Let me just check my understanding with you there. So I think you're making some really interesting points, if I'm right about today, which is that staff confuse recovery and compliance all the time.
Yes,
so if somebody is quiet and smiles and nods and basically does what's expected, regardless of whether they understand what's going on, regardless of whatever the symptoms they're experiencing, it's interpreted as wellness and trying to get better. And for somebody who is confused, distressed, disturbed, angry, bewildered by what's happening to them, and presents that in a way that anybody would. If there was somebody in an area they couldn't get out and they didn't understand why they were there, or what was happening, or with the best will in the world, people maybe were trying to help them. Because there's loads of stuff we do that's really disorientating. So you go to bed, there's one staff member on, then the next day there's somebody else, and they say they're your primary nurse, but the primary nurse was the person before. And then night staff who are trying to help you to sleep, bang up and down and shine torches in your face. It's really,
it's contradictory.
Even if you were really well, it would be very hard to suddenly adapt to living that way. Adding in terms of mental distress as well. So sometimes perhaps you're suggesting that people make a decision about how well somebody is, which is something staff do every single shift, isn't it? They'll have a conversation with someone and try and figure out if things are getting better or worse. And then what they're actually measuring is something very different to recovery. They're measuring how well someone can function in a chaotic and confusing environment.
And that comparison's done, and I would argue without really good supervision or reflective sort of practices, when you take your job for granted, as I said before, as any human does, it's not a criticism, it's a natural order of things in a way. That when you go to work and you go to work for 40 years and you stay in the same environment, you do take it for granted. You start to think that others can see what you can see, which they can't rather. And so if you're a nurse in this environment and you have taken your work for granted, then you're not going to necessarily see all these nuances you just mentioned. And you're not going to necessarily understand that someone's distress isn't related to illness. It's by the very nature of what we're doing to them.
I
think it's okay to acknowledge that, though.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of early questions that have come through, if you don't mind me saying. I've got one. I think these may be from students. The first one is saying, how do you know what method to choose? Which is a really good question. I suppose the first thing is, how do you figure out what question you want to ask? And then how do you figure out what method you want to choose? And the other one's kind of based on as well. And I'm guessing it's a student because everyone's doing QI essays at the moment. They say, why didn't you do QI? Why research?
Okay, so we'll go to QI a bit later, shortly. But the first...
So quality been spared those essays.
third year essays, I suspect. But so what method, I suppose, how did I start to understand the theory? So it builds up. So so we were we were exploring recovery in the context of risk management. There's a lot of complications with this because it changed when you do a study. You have an idea of what you're looking for, and you have to be open to the changes of the study while doing it. So we're grounded theory, this methodology elements. So I was very broad. You know, what's recovery to you? What's risk management to you? And in an inpatient setting, and these were people that had recently been stepped down from an inpatient setting and under a community mental health service. And so what you do with the early interviews, the first, first couple, you sort of get that understanding, and then through the analysis, it kind of homes in your question for the next person, and you also check in what the other person said. And what happens is you start to build interconnections and weave a theory together, which is grounded from the, goes up, if you like.
Like a building.
Yeah, you build it basically. So that's very different for whoever asked the question from other qualitative approaches, perhaps, that you may be more accustomed to, where you interview everyone and then you thematically analyze. That's a very bog standard way of understanding qualitative research, and my apologies for making it so rudimentary, but that was the method really, in a nutshell.
Yeah. So I guess maybe when the student asks, because it's really important, I think, that nurses understand how nurse research is created, how we improve practice by investigating questions that we're curious about, because every discipline needs to be able to do this.
I agree.
Because only a nurse will see things the way a mental health nurse does. And and one of the things you're saying is only service users, people using the service, will understand this from their perspective. So it's really important that we create knowledge that's relevant to service.
There's a slight added point to make.
Go for it.
So, and this may be confusing slightly to students, and I do apologize, but when you're certainly with qualitative research, you come with a philosophical position. You kind of think, well, there's lots of ways of looking at, data of the world, and how I'm going to understand it is through this particular lens. And I use this philosophy called pragmatism, which amongst many other sort of principles, it says that the only way you're going to get good data is asking the people that are directly impacted by the problem. And the idea of research, according to pragmatists, is to find ways forward so we can move forward with difficulties. So you might find when you're doing in certain other sort of sociological sort of qualitative studies, you might do it in a way to unpick and really understand the problem without solution. But what we tried to do is we tried to do it in two parts. We found the problem, risk management impacts on service users by distorting their understanding of reality, and that can be misinterpreted by us as nurses, oh, they're a bit unwell. The second part was actually, how do we look at recovery in that context? And it was interesting because everyone I interviewed talked about risk management and the notion of conformity when they first came into the hospital. So arguably that makes sense. When a person comes in, it's an uncertain situation for staff, they might be more risk adverse. In other words, they might observe the person more. They might be more hypervigilant of the actions of that person, which leads to perhaps practices that service users interpreted as risk management, which were things like physical restraint, forced medication, ward seclusion, etc., etc. Anything that they interpreted was about conformity to the apparatus. The QI question is interesting. In order to do a QI well, quality improvement, there needs to, of course, there are many different ways of doing them. You have to have an understanding of what you're talking and measuring. And actually, the service users didn't understand what risk management was. And they actually interpreted it about conforming to the apparatus. They saw themselves as a problem to staff, i.e., they're therefore a risk to staff. And the way to manage that was when they were just, in their words or in their views, aligning to the restrictions of the ward, they were left alone. They weren't necessarily engaged in lots of observations and things like that. And so that was that's why we didn't do a QI. And also, it, while QI also requires to fully really understand the service and what's going on in order to improve it, depending if you're doing an audit or a service improvement or a service evaluation, I suppose, which are different. But ultimately, while there is so much written about risk management, there is a little understanding about the impact on recovery. You know, there's lots of the people who've written very well, very renowned people, that recovery doesn't really work with risk management. But I wanted to understand really what was going on. And in part, of course, there's a bigger picture. We found this distortion and anxiety about the reality imposed through risk management on patients was a big problem. Flip that on its head. How does recovery work with such opacity? So you're in a world that doesn't make any sense to you. How do you start to have a meaningful life or begin to work that out? So we created another theory, which is called vicarious relatedness, simply by staff engaging and building relationships, which isn't rocket science, but the difference and I suppose the added knowledge was that the staff assists the patient to connect to beliefs and values about a meaningful life. And symbolically brings that into the conversation. And then that is a marker, a benchmarking process. How can we generate activities and things on the ward in order that you can create that connectivity to these beliefs and values that will make your life meaningful? How can we then look at that data to inform recovery plans? How can we then understand how you understand safety in terms of recovery and having a meaningful life? And then you start to see safety in very different ways, Nicky. You start to see safety in psychological safety terms, cultural safety. For those incidentally are interested, comes from New Zealand, about studying Maori people who found when they went on wards, they found that all their religious or spiritual beliefs were completely seen in psychotic terms. So, you know, and accepting that people have religious ideas that we can misinterpret as psychosis, but actually are very meaningful to the person at that time of their recovery. And working, instead of going against the grain with those beliefs, however distorted we might believe they are due to illness, we can actually start creating a relationship. And I'll give you one example. I know I'm rattling on, I hope you don't mind. That we had a service user who was admitted, who could hear the word of, who was told by Jesus, you know, voices, to share the word of God. And so what the person shared with me was, and initially people were saying, well, you know, this is illness, you need medication. Then another staff member tried to connect on religious grounds, say, look, I'm Christian too, but you need medication. So that didn't work because it seemed incongruent to the person. Oh, you're Christian too, let's talk about it. No, you need medication, as an example. So what they did is they brought in someone from her religious community and a chaplain who could connect to her religious ideas at that time. Now we could get really stumped by, oh no, it's psychosis, we shouldn't engage, you know, we're colluding or whatever. Actually, by engaging the world of this service user at the time, she was able to understand through a dialogue, instead of some going, well, this is illness and etc. Through a dialogue, she came to connect to her beliefs that Jesus was compassionate, right? And if he's compassionate, she assumed him to be a male. If compassionate, therefore he may not be forcing me to share the word of God, or he may not mind me not doing it. And so instead of challenging the psychotic phenomena as psychotic phenomena, a person who can connect to that world, you know, vicariously, brought that world into the conversation and therefore was able to unpick a way forward that helped her recovery.
I find it very heartening that kind of the root of all this is connection and care and interest in each other. Because I think one of the things I found really a little bit sad about some of the things you were describing right at the start was the idea that we would be leaving really distressed and disturbed people alone in their own trauma, and then sort of like having them reinforce that stigma. When you were saying, I'm the problem, the service users were saying, I'm the problem because I can't fit in, or because I can't do what I need to do to be left alone. I found that really distressing, as an idea.
In a way, it is
opposite of recovery, isn't it? It's the opposite of recovery. That's what we're trying to do.
But I also get heartened by the fact that they can't fit in. I don't think any human can fit in an institution. And I think actually, if you keep that sense of self that this is wrong, or this isn't my world, and again, forgive me, I'm not saying that we don't, that it's a very challenging job. But if that service user is able to keep connected to, God, stop talking rubbish to me, that's got no bearing on my life, and actually somehow is able to say that, I find that should be supported, because that's a sense of self.
Yeah. And if we were going to set up services again, we wouldn't set them up this way.
No.
And if anybody said write a list of things somebody needs who's very emotionally and psychologically distressed to recover, it wouldn't look like what we're offering.
No.
And that's I think one of the things that's really hard for all staff, really. Certainly hard for service users, but hard for staff to be able to provide the kind of care they want to. So we're coming. We've been talking a lot, guys. We haven't let you join in very much, but do send any questions you've got, and Dave will pick them up. But let's think about if there's anything we need to get to before we finish up, Kris. So we've talked a little bit about how some of the things, how things can be made better. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I want to add that when we're looking at situations in this study, or any study, there's more than one perspective. So whilst I have mentioned that risk management can be very difficult for patients, and that some of the care practices can lead to a confusion about reality, the second set of theories was actually there are some really good work. So let me give you the example that I gave you about the person who heard a voice from Jesus to share the word of God. There was a point with the nursing team that they realized they couldn't connect to those beliefs, and they needed to. And so they did the work to bring these people in. And that really shows the need for advocacy in inpatient units, but not more. We as nurses cannot always advocate because of the legal restrictions, because of our policy. Whatever, there's a wealth of reasons why we can't truly advocate for patients in these settings, but we can bring in people that can, and and we really need to consider that. And when I say advocacy, it is about bringing in people that brings a connection to the patient's world outside of the unit, of the ward.
I don't think that's a particular failing. I think that's a strength of mental health nursing.
Yes, absolutely.
You just look around and find the person who can do it and just get them. And I think there's a lack of ego in that, which I like.
Sorry, forgive me, but you have to recognise you can't do it, and that's the difference. And then, for my argument, that if you from the beginning, if we again were to realise the bizarre nature of our work, we would then realise that we can't do everything to help, and then we would be more creative in working within the restrictions of these difficult environments.
I think as well, it gives you almost permission to be human-centered, person-centered, and be led by the person that you're trying to support. If they're saying all the stuff you're doing and you're absolutely killing yourself to do, none of that's really helping me. What I'd really like is this. And you go, oh, then I'll change. I'll do something different. But I think sometimes the structures we live in as mental health nurses are as imprisoning to us as they are to everybody else. It's really important. One of the things as well that you were saying is actually how much staff and service users have in common when they align. Well, what makes a good place to work and recover.
Ultimately, we're just a bunch of humans looking after a bunch of humans.
I honestly don't know that we can add to that. So as we've been going along, Dave's been tweeting things out, and I would really urge any nurses or student nurses that are watching to read the research that's been published. It's really interesting and important for us to challenge our practice. And sometimes when we're working in environments that are very task orientated and we're being funneled all the time, to actually just step back and think about what we can do differently, because there's things that you can take from this research, from feeling powerful to research, to do research and ask questions, and also to just think, oh, I need to make sure I'm connecting I'm a person looking after people. That's my job. And actually, I think that will really help people and not cost
It
them
doesn't
money.
cost any money to be kind.
That.
As cheesy
No.
as that is.
I know, but it's really easy to forget. Well, just remember to explain what you're doing. That stuff will make a big, big difference to people's lives. So I just want to thank very much our fantastic guest, Kris, today.
Thank you.
It's been really helpful to actually be able to play with ideas. It's exciting to do that. Is there any last words you want before we finish
other
up?
than thank you for the opportunity of sharing some of these ideas and ways forward. I think there's always a way
really
forward, and that's what pragmatists would say. Don't, look forward. Yes, that's important, I guess.
I think so. I think, and also some of the work that you were talking about building on people's voices is really important coming up for next time, because we're looking at children's wellbeing through their own voices, looking at how we can hear children better and why we don't sometimes. And Dr. Michaela James will be with us there from Swansea University talking about her research. So thank you very much for listening today. Absolutely. Big thanks to Kris, our fantastic guest. And it's goodbye from me and Dave. So bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.